For 3 years, the only son of billionaire Ethan Cole had not spoken a single word. Not one. Not to the doctors who came and went with their leather briefcases and careful voices. Not to the tutors hired at enormous cost, nor the therapists flown in from 3 different cities. Not even to his father, who stood outside the boy's bedroom door some nights with his hand pressed flat against the wood, listening to the silence on the other side, as though it might eventually give him something back. The house was enormous and cold, the kind of house that echoed when you walked through it, and the silence that lived inside it had long since stopped feeling like peace and begun to feel like punishment. Then one morning, a new housekeeper arrived. Her name was Naomi Carter. She was 28 years old, and unremarkable in every way that the wealthy tend to notice: no designer bag, no carefully constructed poise, no performance of eagerness. What happened next, no one in that household could have predicted, least of all the billionaire who stood in a guard's uniform and watched it all unfold from the shadows, certain he was the one doing the observing, not understanding yet that he was the one being changed. Ethan Cole had built his fortune the way most self-made men say they did, and almost none of them actually do, from nothing, through an almost inhumane degree of focus, and at a cost that only became visible later, when the thing you had sacrificed everything to protect was already gone. He was 42 years old, and possessed the particular loneliness of men who have never learned to ask for what they need, because asking has always felt like losing. His company, a technology firm with offices on 3 continents, had made him wealthy beyond the kind of number that feels real. His estate in the hills outside the city spread across enough land that on clear mornings, standing at the tall windows of his study, he could watch the fog lift off the valley below and almost convince himself he was the only person left in the world. He had loved that feeling once. Now it just felt accurate. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years ago in a car accident on a wet highway in November. She had been on her way home. She had called him 20 minutes before the crash to say she was stopping for flowers because she had noticed the front hallway felt bare. He had been in a meeting and let the call go to voicemail. He had not listened to it for 6 months afterward, and when he finally did, he sat in his car in the underground parking garage of his office building and did not move for 2 hours. The flowers were never bought. The hallway was still bare. Their son Liam had been 15 when it happened. He was 18 now, and in the space between those years, he had become someone Ethan did not recognize and did not know how to reach. The boy had stopped talking in the weeks following his mother's funeral, gradually at first, the way a tide goes out, a sentence here, a response there, the answers to questions growing shorter and shorter until they simply stopped. He had dropped out of school. He sat for hours each day in the window seat of his room, one knee drawn up to his chest, staring out at the garden with an expression that Ethan had initially mistaken for calm and eventually understood was something else entirely. Liam was not calm. He was submerged. He had gone somewhere beneath the surface of himself and had not yet found a reason to come back up. Ethan had responded the only way he knew how. He had thrown resources at the problem. A child psychologist, then 2, a behavioral specialist, a private tutor who had worked with selective mutism before, a therapist who used art, another who used horses, a nutritionist, a sleep specialist. He had converted one of the spare rooms into something resembling a therapy suite, with soft lighting and carefully chosen colors and a weighted blanket that cost more than most people's monthly rent. None of it reached Liam. Each professional arrived with confidence and departed with apologies, and the boy in the window seat watched them all come and go with that same still, underwater expression, unmoved. His father stood in the doorway each evening before bed and said goodnight to the back of his head, and the back of his head said nothing. And Ethan walked away down the long hallway, with his hands in his pockets, feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in any boardroom, in any negotiation, in any crisis the business had ever handed him. He did not know what to do with helplessness. He had spent his entire adult life making sure he never had to. The morning Naomi arrived, Ethan was in his study reviewing contracts when his head of household staff, a composed man named Gerald, who had worked in the house for 11 years, knocked and entered. "The new housekeeper is here, sir," Gerald said. Ethan did not look up. "Let's hope this one lasts longer than the others," he said. It was not unkind in his mind. It was simply what he believed. The last 3 housekeepers had left within weeks. One had said the house felt sad. One had quit by text. One had cried in the kitchen and apologized and never come back. Gerald said nothing to this, which was one of the things Ethan appreciated about him. He closed the door quietly on his way out. Naomi Carter arrived with a single canvas bag over one shoulder and introduced herself to Gerald in the front hallway with a handshake that was brief and genuine. She was not what the staffing agency had led Ethan to expect. He had vaguely pictured someone older, more professional in appearance, with the practiced neutrality of long domestic service. Naomi was young, with the kind of face that held its emotions openly, deep-set eyes that seemed to be paying attention to more than whatever was directly in front of them, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that rushing rarely helped anything. She looked around the front hallway once, taking in its height and its bare walls and its careful, expensive emptiness, and said nothing about any of it. She asked Gerald where she should begin, and he told her, and she began. She was not impressed by the house. That was the first thing Ethan noticed, though he did not notice it directly. Not yet. He noticed it later, watching from a distance, adding it to a list he was keeping, without entirely realizing he was keeping it. He had decided to watch her. This was not something he was proud of, but it was something he had done with the last 3 housekeepers as well, in a less organized way, standing at the top of the staircase, glancing through doorways. With Naomi, he formalized it. He took a guard's uniform from the staff locker room. It was 2 sizes too large and smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. He put it on early on a Tuesday morning and told Gerald only that he would be observing the household operations in an unofficial capacity and that Gerald should keep it between them. Gerald looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Of course, sir," in the way that Gerald sometimes said things that carried a great deal more meaning than the words themselves. The uniform was not a perfect disguise, but the estate was large and the staff rotation was high, and Naomi had never met the man who owned the house. She took him for exactly what he appeared to be: security personnel, present but peripheral, the kind of person most wealthy households trained you not to notice. The first thing that set Naomi apart was what she did not do. She did not take photographs of the rooms on her phone. She did not linger over the artwork or the furniture, or lean in close to examine the labels on things. She did not ask questions about the family that were not directly related to her work. Most people who came into the house asked about Liam, sometimes out of genuine concern, more often out of curiosity within the first day. Naomi did not ask at all, and Ethan found himself watching to see how she would handle the encounter he knew was coming, because in this house, the encounter was always coming. Liam drifted through the parts of the house that were not his room at unpredictable intervals, usually in the late morning, always silent, always moving along the walls, as though trying to take up as little space as possible. He had a habit of carrying a book he never opened. He had a habit of stopping in the middle of a hallway and standing still for 30 or 40 seconds before continuing, as though he needed to remember where he was going, or remind himself that going somewhere was still a thing he was allowed to do. The first time Naomi encountered him, it was in the second-floor gallery. Liam was moving along the bookshelf that ran the length of the eastern wall, dragging one hand lightly across the spines, and the book he was carrying slipped from the crook of his arm and hit the floor with a flat crack. He stopped. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. 2 of the other household staff were at the far end of the gallery at that moment, replacing a vase of flowers, and neither of them moved toward the book. Naomi was coming out of the adjacent sitting room with a cloth in her hand. She crossed the gallery, bent down, and picked up the book. She held it out to Liam. He looked at her hand, not her face, the way he looked at most things sideways, peripheral, as though direct contact was something he needed to ration carefully. "Happens to me all the time," Naomi said, her voice easy and unhurried. "No big deal. Everybody has rough days." He did not take the book immediately. She did not withdraw her hand. She waited. After a moment, he reached out and took it, and she simply returned to what she had been doing, without ceremony, without the careful, hopeful look that adults always gave Liam when they thought they were making progress. She just went back to work. Ethan, standing at the end of the corridor with his arms loosely folded, had watched every second of it. He stood there after Naomi had disappeared through the doorway, looking at the place where she had been, and he felt something shift in him that he could not immediately name. That evening, passing by the kitchen, he heard singing. It was quiet, barely above a hum, really something without words, a gentle melodic phrase repeated and varied, the kind of thing people do when they think they are entirely alone. He recognized it as a hymn his grandmother had sung, or something very close to one, and the recognition hit him somewhere unexpected. He stood in the hallway outside the kitchen for a moment, listening. Then he heard something else, a sound from the staircase. He turned. Liam was standing at the bottom of the stairs in bare feet, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. He stayed there for almost 2 full minutes before Ethan moved and broke the spell, and Liam looked up, startled, and retreated back toward his room. But it was the first time in months Ethan had seen his son move towards something rather than away from it. He stood in the hallway for a long time after the boy was gone. In the days that followed, Ethan watched Naomi the way he watched everything he was trying to understand, systematically, patiently, with the detached attention of someone used to reading situations for information. What he gathered was this: she ate little, always in the staff kitchen, always quickly, and whatever she brought for herself was modest to the point of frugality. She sent money somewhere, he knew this because Gerald mentioned, offhandedly, that she had asked about Western Union locations on her first day off. She took the bus to and from the estate, rather than accepting the car service that was offered to all household staff. She wore the same 3 blouses in rotation. She carried a photograph in the breast pocket of her uniform. He had seen her touch it once, briefly, in passing, the way people touch things for reassurance. She did not complain. She did not perform contentment either. She was simply present, doing her work with a steadiness that Ethan found himself returning to in his mind in the evenings when he sat in his study with a glass of something he no longer tasted. What she did with Liam, she did so quietly that it barely looked like doing anything at all. She did not approach him. She did not try to engage him in conversation. She did not bring him anything she had not been asked to bring. What she did was make herself nearby in a way that was not intrusive, sitting in the reading room off the main hall with a book of her own when Liam was somewhere in the vicinity, working at the low table in the garden room when he drifted through, never looking up to signal that she had noticed him, never positioning herself in a way that required him to acknowledge her. She created, without appearing to try, the conditions under which Liam might simply choose to exist in the same space as another person, with no expectation attached to that choice. And slowly, tentatively, like something living moving toward warmth, Liam began to drift in her direction. One afternoon, Naomi sat in the garden room for nearly an hour, reading while Liam stood at the window 20 feet away, ostensibly looking out at the grounds. She did not speak. He did not speak. When she left, she paused at the doorway and said, without turning around, "Good book, by the way, if you ever want to borrow it." She was gone before he could respond, which meant there was nothing he needed to respond to. Ethan watched from the courtyard below, through the tall window, and thought, she understands something about him that none of the professionals did. He began to find reasons to be near her. He took longer routes through the east wing. He lingered in the service corridor off the kitchen at times when Naomi was likely to pass through. He told himself he was still observing for security reasons, assessing her character, her trustworthiness, but he had long since stopped believing his own cover story, even if he was not yet willing to give it up. One afternoon he found himself leaning against the wall near the staff break room while she sat at the small table inside writing in a notebook, and she glanced up and said, "You do a lot of walking for a security guy." He said he was doing rounds. She said, "Uh-huh," and returned to her notebook, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was something in that neighborhood. He walked away feeling oddly caught, though she had said nothing that should have made him feel that way. It was Gerald who finally asked him directly what he was doing. They were standing in the corridor outside the estate office late on a Thursday, after most of the staff had gone home, and Gerald said, with the careful formality of a man who has been choosing his words since long before this conversation, "If I may, sir, the current arrangement carries some risk." Ethan asked what he meant. Gerald said, "If Miss Carter learns that the man she's been speaking with as a fellow employee is in fact her employer, she may not respond well." Ethan said he understood the risk. Gerald said nothing further. He was very good at saying nothing in ways that communicated everything. Ethan knew he was right. He continued wearing the uniform. One evening, on the pretext of checking the external locks on the garden side of the estate, Ethan ended up near the south terrace where Naomi was sitting on the low stone wall in the last of the day's light, her shoes off, watching the garden. She had a cup of something warm in both hands. He stopped a reasonable distance away, and after a moment she said, without looking at him, "You can sit down. I don't bite." He sat. They were quiet for a while. The garden was thick with late-season flowers, purple and gold, and the light was turning the color of warm copper across everything. Then she said simply, "He's going to be okay, you know." He asked who she meant. She said, "The kid, Liam." She said his name the same way she said everything unhurried, with the weight that the word deserved, and no more. Ethan asked how she could know that. She said, "Because he's still paying attention. People who've given up don't pay attention anymore. They check out." He hasn't checked out. He's just waiting for something to feel safe enough to come back to. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if he never finds it?" She turned and looked at him for the first time, directly, and said, "Then the people around him keep making the world feel a little safer, every day, until he does. That's all you can do. You just keep showing up." He did not say anything. She looked back at the garden. He sat there, in his oversized uniform, in the warm copper light, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for 3 years. He thought, later, about what she had said, "Keep showing up," and realized with a kind of slow-burning shame how rarely he had actually done that. He had provided for Liam. He had hired people. He had stood in doorways and said goodnight to the back of a head. He had thrown money at the wound and called it treatment. But he had never simply sat down on the floor outside his son's bedroom and stayed there. He had never said, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and you don't have to do anything about that." He had been afraid. It was the first time he had admitted that to himself. Clearly not that he had been busy, not that he had not known what to do, but that he had been afraid. Afraid that if he sat with the grief long enough, it would swallow him whole. Afraid that Liam's silence was a verdict he could not appeal. The night the storm came was a Thursday, in early autumn. The rain had been building all day, the kind of heavy, gray sky pressure that gets into everything and makes the air feel smaller. Ethan was in his study when he heard it, a sound from the upper floor that was not the storm, something breaking. Then a sound that was harder to describe, not a scream, not crying, but the physical expression of something that had no other way out, a tearing sound that seemed to come from inside a person rather than from any object. He was at the stairs in seconds. Gerald was already in the hallway. They reached Liam's door and heard it, continuing not violence directed outward, but the kind of internal collapse that makes a person move through a room like they are trying to outrun something inside their own body, knocking into things, unable to stop. Ethan reached for the door handle. Behind him, he heard quick footsteps on the stairs. Naomi appeared, still in her uniform, her face calm in the way that calm becomes a choice rather than a feeling. She moved past Ethan without ceremony. She put her hand on the door. She looked at him once, just a look, nothing said, and went in. She did not turn on the lights. The room was lit only by the storm-gray light from the uncovered window. Liam was in the corner by the desk, his back against the wall, his hands pressed to the sides of his head, shaking. Naomi crossed the room without hesitation and lowered herself to the floor beside him. She did not say anything immediately. She simply put her arms around him, not tentatively, not carefully, but with the full warmth of someone who has done this before, who knows that what a person in that state needs is the undeniable physical fact of another human being choosing to stay close. Liam shook against her. The storm threw itself at the windows. And then Naomi began to speak quietly, just above a whisper, the words going directly into the room rather than out of it. You don't have to be strong right now, she said. You've been so strong for so long. You don't have to keep doing that. She paused. Your mama wouldn't want this for you. She wouldn't want you carrying all of this alone. She loved you too much for that. She paused again. Nobody's leaving you. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Liam's shaking deepened. Something was breaking open in him. And then, from somewhere deep in his chest, from somewhere that had been locked for 3 years, a sound came. It started as breath. It became a sob. And through the sob, in a voice that was rusty and cracked from disuse, the word came out, Mom. 1 word. 3 letters. The first thing Liam Cole had said in 37 months. Ethan, standing in the doorway, felt the room tilt around him. He put one hand against the doorframe. He did not trust himself to move. Naomi held Liam tighter. His son was crying fully, completely, without restraint for the first time since his mother's funeral. Ethan stood in the doorway and let his own tears fall without wiping them away, and the storm held them all inside that night, like something held in a cupped hand. When it was over, Liam had fallen asleep against Naomi's shoulder on the floor, and she had stayed there, unmoving, until she was sure his breathing had steadied. She looked up once, toward the doorway, and found it empty. Ethan had stepped back into the hallway before she could see his face. He stood with his back against the wall in the dark, his hand still pressed to his chest, and he thought, she just gave my son back to me. And then, almost immediately, the other thought, she doesn't know who I am. The week that followed was the most hopeful Ethan had experienced in years. Liam ate breakfast at the kitchen table for the first time, a full meal, slowly, but seated and present. He walked in the garden in the afternoons, sometimes alongside Naomi when she was watering the planters along the south wall. He did not talk much a word here, a short phrase there, but the silence was different now. It was thinner. It had gaps in it. He wrote a few lines in the notebook Naomi had left outside his door without comment. He opened the curtains in the morning. He asked, one afternoon, if Naomi would show him which plants needed cutting back. And she did. And they worked side by side in the low autumn light without needing to fill the space between them. Ethan watched from the study window, and for the first time, in 3 years, he felt something that was not quite happiness. He was too honest with himself for that, but was the shape where happiness might eventually return. He was also, increasingly, aware of something he did not want to examine too directly. He looked forward to the evenings on the terrace. He noticed when Naomi was not in a room, he entered. He found himself thinking about what she had said, keeping showing up. And he thought about it in the context of her too, not only his son. He was 42 years old and had not thought about another person this way since Margaret, and the guilt of that sat alongside the feeling itself, like two things that could not be reconciled. He put it aside. There were more pressing problems. The most pressing was that he was still wearing a guard's uniform. Gerald had mentioned it twice more. Ethan had deflected both times. But the reckoning arrived, not through Gerald but through chance. On an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when Naomi was covering for an absent staff member and found herself in the East Wing reorganizing the filing room off the estate office. She opened the wrong door. Inside the office itself, on the wall behind the desk, there was a framed photograph, a magazine profile from several years ago, Ethan in a suit at a podium, the headline visible below his face. She stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she walked to the bulletin board near the door, where the staff schedule was posted, and looked at the name at the top, E. Cole, principal resident. She looked back at the photograph. She stood very still for a moment, in the way people stand when they are arranging something into a shape they do not want to be true. Then she put everything she had been carrying back on the shelf, walked out of the office, and closed the door with great care. She found him in the corridor near the north terrace late that afternoon. He was in the uniform. She stood in front of him and looked at him with an expression that was not anger, not yet, but was the precursor to it, the quiet, cold clarity that comes before the feeling arrives in full. She said, "Who are you?" It was not a question with a rising inflection. It was a statement shaped like a question. He did not insult her by pretending he did not understand. He said, My name is Ethan Cole. I own this house. She said nothing. He watched her process it. The uniform, the weeks of conversation, the evenings on the terrace, the things she had said to him, believing he was someone who could not affect her life. Her jaw tightened. She said, "You were watching me." He said, "Yes." She said, "You were testing me." He said, "At first." She said, "And then?" He did not answer. She said, "So everything I said to you, everything I told you about myself, you were collecting it, filing it away. The whole time you were my employer, and I didn't know." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for another moment, and then said, very quietly, "That's a cruel thing to do to a person," and walked away. The conversation with Naomi moved through the house over the next 2 days like weather. She did not quit, but she did not speak to Ethan. She continued her work with the same steadiness as before. She continued to be present for Liam in the same unforced way. Ethan watched this, her ability to hold two separate things separately, and felt it as a kind of rebuke, which it probably was. He tried to apologize once in the hallway. She said, "Mr. Cole, I'm working." He left her alone. He could not, however, leave himself alone. He sat in his study in the evenings and went back through everything: the uniform, the cover story, the weeks of proximity conducted under false pretenses, and he saw it clearly for what it was: fear disguised as caution. He had not trusted her, because trusting anyone had become something his body rejected since Margaret died. He had not been able to simply hire someone and believe in them. He had needed to verify, to observe, to maintain the illusion of control. And in doing so, he had treated a woman who had given his son back to him with something she was right to call cruel. Liam had seen some of the confrontation, not the words, but the shape of it, the tension in the corridor that afternoon. He had retreated to his room, and the following morning he was quieter again, sitting closer to the window, and Ethan felt the old fear rise up in him like cold water. He went to Naomi's quarters that evening and knocked. She opened the door. He said, "Whatever you're feeling toward me is deserved." But he saw something today that scared him, and I'm asking you not as your employer. I'm asking you as his father. Please don't let him think he's losing you. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "He's not losing me. I need you to understand that that boy is not a casualty of whatever's between us. I won't do that to him." And she went to Liam's room and knocked, and said through the door, "Hey, I'm still here. Nothing's changed. You want some tea?" And after a pause, a long pause, the kind that carries the weight of everything a person has been through, Liam said, "Yeah." His voice was small and croaked at the edges, but it was his voice. Ethan stood at the end of the hall and could not speak. In the days after that, something shifted in the household's architecture. Ethan stopped wearing the uniform. He appeared as himself in his own clothes, in the kitchen in the mornings, at the table for dinner. He had been eating alone in his study for 3 years, and he stopped doing that. Liam, the first evening Ethan appeared at the dinner table, looked at his father from across the room for a long moment, as though recalibrating something. Then he sat down. They did not talk much, but they were in the same room, at the same table, eating at the same time, and that was more than they had managed in years. Ethan said good night when they were done, and Liam said, "Night, Dad," which were the first words he had directed at his father in longer than either of them could accurately remember. And Ethan walked to his study and sat down in the dark for a while, with the feeling still sitting in his chest, warm and enormous, and a little fragile, the way important things often feel when they are new. He had a conversation with Naomi that was actual, not a surveillance session in disguise, but the real thing. Two people in a room choosing to tell each other the truth. He apologized. He did not perform the apology or accessorize it with explanations. He said he had been afraid, and that fear had made him dishonest, and that she had deserved better from the beginning, and that he was sorry. Naomi listened to this in her characteristic way, giving him her full attention, without giving him absolution, before she was ready to give it. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" He said yes. She said, "When you were out there watching me, was there ever a moment when you thought, maybe I should just go introduce myself? Like a normal person?" He thought about it. He said, "Yes." The second day, she said, "What stopped you?" He said, "I didn't know how." She was quiet. Then she said, "That might be the most honest thing you've said to me since I got here." He said, "It might be." She looked at him in a measuring way and then said, "Okay, just that. Okay." He understood it to mean, "We are not finished with this, but we are continuing." She told him about her brother Marcus that evening. She did not make it a dramatic story. She never made things dramatic if she could avoid it. She said Marcus had been 12 when the silence started for him, not so different from Liam's silence, and that everyone in their neighborhood had written him off in the way that people write off children from certain neighborhoods, children who don't behave in the expected ways, children whose need is visible and therefore inconvenient. She said she had been 17 and had no tools and no resources, just the stubborn certainty that her brother was still in there. She had sat with him every day after school. She had not asked him questions. She had read out loud to him, watched television beside him, cooked with him in the kitchen when he would allow it. She had kept his world small enough to be safe, and then, very slowly, expanded it. He was 24 now, she said. He worked at a library. He had a cat named something ridiculous that she could never remember. He called her every Sunday. Ethan listened to all of this without saying anything, because he understood that this was not a story she was telling him. For his benefit, she was telling it because it was simply true, because it was the part of herself she had brought to this house, and he was finally in a position to receive it honestly. He said, "You're extraordinary." She said, "I'm not. I just paid attention." He said, "In my world, that's extraordinary." She looked at him and said, "Your world needs to get a better baseline." He laughed. It surprised both of them. She smiled, an actual, full smile, not the restrained version she had been offering him since the confrontation, and it changed the quality of the room. He thought, there it is. There is the thing I have been watching for without knowing I was watching for it. Liam was playing piano again by Gustav, Gusta, and he had started learning as a child, John, and the old upright piano in the music room had been closed and covered. One morning, Naomi was passing the music room and heard notes exploratory, uncertain, the sound of someone remembering something they thought they had forgotten. She stopped outside the door. She did not go in. She listened for a few minutes and then continued down the hall, because she had learned that the best thing you can do for someone reclaiming something is to give them privacy while they do it. She mentioned it to Ethan that evening. He went and stood outside the music room door, as he had once stood outside his son's bedroom door, with his hand pressed against the wood, listening. But this time, the silence was not on the other side. On the other side, there was music, halting and unpracticed and more beautiful to him than anything he had ever paid a ticket price to hear. He did not go in. He stood and listened and let himself cry, quietly, without drama, the way grief cries when it is turning into something else. Winter came early that year. The house changed in winter. The high windows let in a different quality of light, slant, and silver. And the garden became architectural, bare and clean, the way stripped things sometimes become more beautiful rather than less. Liam had started going back to some classes. Not full enrollment, but a course here and there at the community college across the valley. And he came home in the afternoons and sat at the kitchen table and did work and sometimes, without looking up from his notebook, said things like, "There was a guy in my class today who argued with the professor for 20 minutes about something he was completely wrong about," and Naomi would say, "What was he wrong about?" And Liam would explain, and she would say, "Yeah, he was wrong," and they would continue in companionable silence, and Ethan would sit across the table with his coffee and his laptop and feel the strange new normalcy of it as though it were a gift he was still learning to accept. He noticed, during those evenings, that Liam had started making small jokes, quiet ones, delivered deadpan, that required you to be paying attention to catch them. This was something he had not done since before the accident. It had been one of the things that made Liam unmistakably his mother's son, and when Ethan caught one for the first time and laughed and looked up, Liam was already looking back down at his notebook with the ghost of a grin, and Naomi across the table met Ethan's eyes briefly with something in hers that said, "There he is. There is the boy." He established a foundation in December. He had been thinking about it since the autumn, a foundation to support adolescent mental health resources, to fund programs in schools and clinics that served communities without the access his family's wealth had provided. He had spent hours reviewing research, speaking to counselors, and visiting 2 underfunded youth crisis centers in the city, whose waiting lists ran to several months because the need was so much greater than anyone in a position to act had bothered to measure. What he found in those places was familiar. Children sitting in rooms, not talking, waiting for someone to believe they were worth waiting for. He came home each time, feeling both crushed and clarified. He named the foundation the Margaret Cole Foundation, and he made the announcement quietly, without press, because this was not for his reputation. He had enough of a reputation, and it had never once kept him warm. The foundation was for something else, something he was still learning to name, or perhaps something he had already learned to name from watching the way one person had moved through his house and changed every room she entered, simply by caring enough to be present in it. When he told Liam, his son looked at him for a moment, and then said, "Mom would have liked that." Ethan said, "I know." They sat with that for a moment, long enough for the weight of it to settle and become something bearable, something that could be carried going forward instead of set down and walked away from. Then Liam said, "Can I help with it?" And Ethan said, "I was going to ask you the same thing." He asked Naomi to come on as the foundation's first program director. He framed it carefully. He did not want it to feel like payment for what she had given them, because it was not payment, and she was too perceptive to accept something that felt like a transaction dressed up as an opportunity. He told her the truth, that she understood something about what these kids needed, that no one he had encountered in professional or clinical contexts had demonstrated, and that understanding was a rare and valuable thing, and he wanted it applied somewhere it could reach more than one family. She sat with the offer for 2 days. When she came back to him, she said, "If I take this, it's because I believe in the work, not as a favor to you." He said, "I wouldn't want it any other way." She said, "And I want real autonomy over program decisions." He said, "Done." She said, "Okay then." He extended his hand. She shook it, and then she held on to it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and he did not let go either, and they both noticed it, and neither of them said anything about it. Spring arrived with the particular enthusiasm of seasons that follow difficult winters. The garden, which had become a project for all 3 of them in different ways, was full. By April, Liam had suggested planting a section of wildflowers in the eastern corner, and Naomi had said she knew what to do with the herb beds along the south wall, and Ethan had found himself spending money at the garden center with a lightness he had not felt spending money in years, because this was something he could tend with his hands. They worked out there on Saturdays, the 3 of them, not always in proximity, but always within the same space, and the garden became something they shared in the way families share things, not through deliberate construction, but through the gradual accumulation of small, repeated choices to be in the same place at the same time. One Saturday afternoon in May, Liam called out from the eastern corner where he was working with a trowel, "Dad! Naomi! Come look at this!" They crossed the garden, and he showed them where the wildflowers had started coming up small, confident, various, crowding toward the light. He was grinning. Ethan could not remember the last time he had seen his son grin without self-consciousness, without measuring himself against something, just genuinely delighted by something growing out of the ground. Naomi said, "You planted those well." Liam said, "We planted them." She said, "Yeah, we did." And without discussion, all 3 of them stayed in that corner of the garden for a long time, not doing much, just being there together, and the afternoon went gold around them. That evening, after Liam had gone inside, Ethan and Naomi stayed out in the garden until the light went entirely away. The stars appeared in sections above the hills, and the garden released the warmth that had gathered all day slowly into the cooling air, and Ethan said what he had been trying to say for a long time. He said it simply, without orchestration, standing in the place where they had first tended something together. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to know it's not about the foundation and it's not about Liam. It's just about you and about me." She was quiet, looking up at the sky. He said, "You walked into this house, and it was the coldest, saddest place I had ever been in, and I had stopped being able to imagine it being anything else, and you changed that, not through anything grand, just by being exactly who you are every single day, with no performance and no agenda. And I know I made it harder than it needed to be at the beginning because I didn't know how to trust anyone anymore. I'm still learning how, but I know that whatever I feel when you walk into a room is something I have not felt in a very long time, and I would rather tell you that than spend another week pretending I don't feel it." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what the first thing I thought was when I found out you were the owner of this house?" He said, "No." She said, "I thought, of course he is. Of course, the one person in this whole place who actually talked to me like I was a person was the one person lying to me about who he was." He said, "I know." She said, "And also, and this is the part I'm still working out, I thought, but he did talk to me like I was a person. And that's not nothing." He said, "It's not enough." She said, "No, but it's a start." The proposal was not planned. This is worth saying, because Ethan was a man who planned things, who organized outcomes and minimized surprise as a professional practice and a personal defense. He had not planned this. It happened on a Thursday evening in the garden, in June, near the herb beds along the south wall, where the lavender was fully up and the air was soft with it. He had come out to find her there, and they had stood talking about nothing in particular, the Foundation's first grant cycle, a book Liam had recommended to both of them, independently, the possibility of adding a second section of wildflowers next spring, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the warmth of a perfectly ordinary evening, something in Ethan simply became certain. He stopped talking mid-sentence. She noticed and looked at him. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. He had been carrying the ring for 2 weeks, not knowing exactly when, only knowing that the moment would be clear. When it arrived, and he went down on one knee there, between the lavender and the rosemary on the old stone path, and he said, "You did not just save my son. You saved me. You saved this house, this family, everything in it. And I know I am asking you to take on something that is not simple, and I am asking you knowing that you are a person who has never needed anything I could provide, and who could walk away from all of this tomorrow and be entirely fine. I am asking not because I can offer you something you lack, but because I want to be in your life, and I want you in mine, and whatever form that takes is worth asking about. Will you marry me?" There was a silence, in which the garden breathed around them, and the stars were beginning to appear in the paling sky. Then from behind them, from somewhere near the terrace, a voice said, "Please say yes." They both turned. Liam was standing at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that was half embarrassment and half everything he had been unable to feel for 3 years, all of it present at once. Naomi laughed a real laugh, startled out of her, and then she was crying, and she said yes, and Ethan stood up, and she came to him, and they held each other in the lavender while Liam said, finally, from the terrace, and pretended to inspect a plant so that he would have something to look at other than them. They sat together afterward on the terrace steps, Ethan, Naomi, Liam, as the night settled fully in and the valley below disappeared into its dark. Liam was in the middle, which had not been arranged but felt right. At some point he said, quietly, to no one in particular, she would have loved her. "Mom," Ethan said, "I know she would have." Naomi reached out and put her hand over Liam's and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the honesty of his words. They sat there until the stars were fully up above the hills, and the night was warm, and the garden around them held in it all the things they had planted and tended, all the growing things that had come up through the dark, into the light, patient and various and alive. Sometimes the person who heals a broken heart is not the one who arrives with any answer or any cure. Sometimes it is simply the one who walks in quietly, pays attention, and stays.